In the name of the one God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. I want to talk with you today about the divine surprise. I want to talk with you today about letting God surprise us as we follow the hope that God has set before us. Yesterday, Vestry, the board of directors of Calvary Church met for our annual retreat. And we met in part because we wanted to be sure that we were drafting for ourselves a vision, a set of goals for this coming year of what we wanted to accomplish for this church and this community that God has put into our care and trust. The Reverend Robert Phillips from the Diocesan House, who you may remember, he has worked with us before in drafting visions and holding our retreats, facilitated this retreat for us. And as we worked together, as we tried to come together with what it was that God was calling us to this next step to help Calvary grow in its mission and invigorate its purpose in this place, he asked us at the close of these 3 hours what feeling we had left this meeting together with. And it was a great and blessed time. And while there was a wide variety of responses, one theme kept through strongly. Many people said, we left that meeting feeling hopeful. And Reverend Phillips offered his word of gratitude, but he also offered a word of caution, or maybe a word of challenge. And he quoted for us the words of that great preacher, Pastor Peter Gomes, who was the pastor at Memorial Church at Harvard, who said that there's a great difference between hope and optimism, that optimism is just sort of thinking that everything will turn out all right. And hope is the willingness to endure whatever is necessary to encounter the divine surprise. Pastor Peter Gomes said that hope is the willingness to endure whatever is necessary to encounter the divine surprise. And I believe that message is one that has great meaning for us as a church, as a community. It has great meaning for us as we reflect on and give thanks for this rich history that we're celebrating during Black History Month. It has great meaning for Calvary as we think about our next steps forward, and it's illuminated and made clear in the gospel today. So I myself was sort of surprised hearing him share these words with us as I looked at the readings, as I had my sermon planned, to be surprised by the meaning that was brought forth as they all sort of came together. So I want to delve real closely in to the gospel reading today to think about what we learn there, what we see there, and then talk a bit about its implications. We've been talking for the last several weeks, reading the story of the early moments in Jesus's ministry, his calling of the first disciples, when he declares his mission statement in the synagogue, when he goes forward, when he's rejected by his own family members and friends, and when he continues trying to think about how he's going to carry out this mission that God has put into his hands. And we hear today the story of the calling of Peter, who of course for us is probably one of the most famous of the disciples, dear to Jesus's heart, full of all of the foibles and failings that we ourselves feel as disciples, and yet faithful to the end. And it comes about in the gospel we heard today from Luke's gospel in this way. Jesus has become quite famous at this point already, growing, well, locally famous. And the folks in that area around the Sea of Galilee are flocking to hear his preaching. And again, you got to remember in these ancient days before modern amplification, how you were going to talk to a crowd was always a bit of a question and a trial. And Jesus encounters this problem that the crowd is crowding in so close that no one can hear what it is he has to say. He's got to find some space. So he sort of backs them down to the shores of the River Galilee, of the Sea of Galilee. And there he sees this fisherman, Peter, who's there working on his boats. He and the other fishermen, James and John, they've been working, laboring all night long, trying to catch some fish. Most of the species of fish that they fish there on the Sea of Galilee are nocturnal. They're active at night, so that's when you can catch them. And during the day, they sit down on the banks, on the shore, on the riverbed, the ocean bed, and going sort of a dormant phase. They don't exactly sleep, but they don't move much, and they're resting there down on the bottom. So it becomes almost impossible to catch them. So you got to get them at night. And they've been working all night. And they've had one of those days, which I know we're all familiar with, where despite your best labor and efforts and all the expertise and skill that you've learned, you can't seem to make it work at all. They haven't brought in a single fish. And so they decide to call it quits, to say, admit their losses and pull in for the day. And they're cleaning their nets, which you have to do each day to make sure they continue working. And he calls them over and he says, let me get in your boat. And I want you to think about that from Peter's perspective. Imagine you have been laboring all night long and you have nothing to show for it. And here you are cleaning your nets, and really all you want to do is go home, have a little bite to eat, get some sleep so that maybe you can try again the next day and hope that things will turn out better. As we heard those words of Peter Gomes cautioning us about the difference between optimism and hope, Peter in this moment is resting in a mindset of optimism. He's thinking, well, maybe it will all just turn out better tomorrow if I just do the same thing that I've been doing. And Jesus calls him to a kind of interruption. Again, imagine you've been laboring all day and this stranger, you don't know who he is. There's a crowd of people on the shore. You probably look to see what's happening over here. And here's this man, everybody's clamoring after him. And he turns to you and says, come over here so I can get in your boat. It's probably the last thing that you want to do is give this stranger a moment. But Peter does it. And he says, all right, pulls the boat over, and Jesus steps into the boat and preaches so he can pull away from the shore and get a little bit of distance from the people so they can hear what it is he has to say. And I imagine Peter in that moment, as Gail Fisher-Stewart would often say, in my sanctified imagination, I imagine him there sitting, still working on his nets, pulling out the kinks, pulling out the debris so they can work, but listening with curiosity and maybe a moment of surprise, not expecting what's happened here. This was not how he was expecting his day to turn out, but he engages it with a sense of grace. He's willing to endure something, perhaps in the hope of finding something better, or maybe just in a moment of curiosity. Jesus finishes his preaching, and then he looks down at these empty nets and says, so you've been fishing all night? And he said, yeah, I didn't catch anything. He says, throw out the net one more time on the other side of the boat. And again, this is a moment where Peter has to be willing to let go, because Peter's a fisherman. This is his whole life, and he's an expert in it. And probably, you know how it is when you're deep in an industry, when you know your field well, and many of you know this, you can recognize a fellow laborer right away, just by the language they use, the way they dress, the way they move. You know when someone else knows the same skills that you have. And I'm pretty sure Peter looks at this guy and says, this man's no fisherman. He might be a carpenter or a farmer or something, but he doesn't know this sea. And here he says to him, let out the net one more time. And Peter knows this won't work. He says, the fish, they're only active at night, and now it's bright in the morning. We've been working at it all night. But he lets go one more time, and he says, all right. And he throws the net out, and there's this great surprise. The net is full, so full that they can barely bring it in. And he falls down on his feet, his knees before Jesus, and says, Lord, depart from me. I don't know what's going on here. But he agrees, and he pulls the nets in, and they come to the shore. And there's this third moment of letting go, right? Because this is the optimism, this thing that Peter was hoping for. I hope to try again tomorrow and get a better catch. And he's pulled in so many fish, he can't even bring the nets in. And there's even that moment of terror, you know, like that they question with the thing they say about be careful what you wish for. They've pulled in so many fish that the boats are about to sink. It's terrifying in a way to finally receive the thing you've been hoping for so long. They pull the boats in, and then Peter leaves it all behind to follow Jesus. And just think about that for a moment. He's been working all night, hoping to get a catch, getting nothing, thinking, all right, I'm just going to try again tomorrow. And Jesus brings him the very thing he was waiting for all night, a full catch, as full as it could possibly be. This is a great bounty for a fisherman. He can feed his family. He can sell those fish in market. He can advance. Maybe he could buy another set of boats with all these fish that he's going to sell. It's exactly what he was waiting for. And Jesus demands nothing of him. He says, you know, now I've got you all this fish. You better follow me. That's what you owe me. Jesus doesn't say that. He goes to walk off. And Peter abandons it all to follow Christ. I wonder sometimes about what happened with the boats and the fish. They mentioned they leave it all behind. Was it a bounty that he left for all those who were waiting to hear Jesus's word? Did he make sure that they had something to eat on his way? Did someone else take up those boats and find their own career fishing? I don't know. He doesn't know. He leaves it all because he's been willing to endure whatever's necessary to encounter the divine surprise, the blessings that we had not even expected, that we hadn't even hoped for ourselves. We hadn't imagined. These are the things that God puts into our hands. We've all got dreams, and we've all got hopes, And we've all got ambitions. We've all got plans for how we expect our world to turn out. We've all got prayers and things we ask God for. And what we proclaim in faith is that God has better things planned for us. God has surprises for us that we could never have imagined and hoped for. And it's in this process of letting go, of being willing to endure whatever is necessary in the trust and faith that God has something greater planned for us, that we encounter what it means to be disciples. That was the story of Peter that day. That is the challenge which Pastor Gomes called us all towards. And it's one we see repeated throughout this history that we hold up during this time of Black History Month. Gail, as she put together these prayers for last year, lifted up Martin de Porres as the first saint that we would recognize and remember in this. And the story of his life, and I'm not going to get into all of it because I don't want to keep you too long, but is a story of wonderful, astounding, and unimaginable surprises. The child of an emancipated Black woman and a nobleman. He was, in his own birth, an impossibility. No one expected this child to be born, or certainly not to be acknowledged. And one who in his calling, in his witness to those most sick, most distressed, became an light and example for a whole continent. No one expected the way Martin's life would turn out, least of all him, but God had planned greater things for him. And this seems again and again, and I say this as a second-hand observer and one who has been blessed to be welcomed into this fellowship of Calvary. But as I review, and as we've been reviewing the stories of Black history for my son, this seems again and again the history of Black folk here in America, of promises that seemed so impossible. The words that we sang out, that we heard Susan sing out in Lift Every Voice and Sing in the Black National Anthem, walking across a stony road, walking on a way watered with tears, and somehow encountering still in the midst of it, in all of the trials, joy and blessings and art and love and genius that the world could not have imagined. This has been Calvary's story as well, of when we are faithful, when we are willing to walk in that unexpected way towards which God is calling us, to leave behind the things we had known, of encountering blessings we had not even imagined. It's written throughout the whole story of this congregation and is where God is still calling us to be. Now, I don't mean to say that our plans aren't important. God loves, I think, our desires, our ambitions, our dreams for ourselves, and sometimes they become part of God's plan for us. There's always this sense, though, that we have to hold on to them lightly. We have to be willing to be surprised. We can get hunkered down in our assumptions about what's going to happen. And I know as you look at the course of your own lives, you see how that turns out sometimes. Sometimes our own plans are dashed away. Sometimes everything we had thought about how our lives will turn out is turned upside down in a single moment. And the question that time is, will we continue to walk forward in grace? Will we trust that God is calling and blessing us with something beyond our own imagining? Those plans matter because they're part of what gets us moving. They're part of what gets us out of bed each day, to try once more, to be willing to meet Christ wherever he is. If Peter had sat home that day without his plans of bringing in a full catch, he would never have met the Lord. Those plans matter, and I don't mean to say that they don't. And I do believe that God cares for them and honors them as much as is possible as they fit into that divine plan. Michael Livingston, many of you know, a member of the vestry, said it to me this way years ago when we were putting together our strategic plan when he was senior warden. He said, you must have a plan to deviate from. And I think that's the way it works, that we have our plans, we have our dreams, we have our ambitions, and you need those to get moving. But you have to be willing to deviate when the grace of God shows up, when the Lord shows up and maybe hands you everything that you were hoping for and expecting. But in that moment, you see that there's something greater still waiting. In that willingness to put the nets behind, to leave the boats to shore, and to follow wherever Christ leads. This is our calling each day as people of God, as disciples. And I believe it is also the calling that's given to us as Calvary Church in the days, weeks, and months ahead, carrying with us all of this great and rich history, knowing that God is calling us to blessings beyond our imagining, and being willing to endure it all to encounter that joyful and blessed divine surprise. And I pray for each of us that we find the courage and strength of Peter Gomes, of St. Peter, of Martin de Porres, and all the saints we remember, of all those who have gone before at Calvary, to endure whatever is necessary to encounter that surprise. Amen.